One of your points was the opportunity to push toward resiliency. Our next speaker and his community have been investing in resiliency for a long, long time, back when it wasn't even called resiliency. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Trautman, the manager of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services Group, and he's going to talk about comprehensive local programming, soup to nuts. Tim?
I want to start by thanking ASFPM for putting together this panel. As most of you in the room know, that at the local level, that's where, to be honest, the good, the bad, and even the ugly can all happen at the local level. And so I think it's great to actually put together a focused panel on local issues, and hopefully what we're covering today is the good, the successes. Yesterday, Dave Miller talked about moving the needle very briefly, and how as a nation we're really not moving the needle. So my hook, to get everyone to kind of stay for the last few slides of the presentation if I have time, is we put together actually some data for Charlotte-Mecklenburg that quantifies and shows that we actually are moving the needle quite a bit. And it's brand new information and brand new data that we've kind of scrubbed out. So I want to start with a quick story. My son missed his birthday this week. The conference is always right around his birthday. He turned 10 years old. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to him. And doing volunteer work for ASFPM, once a year, Chad Berginis, as a side note, sends thank you notes to our bosses and directors. So Chad, I'm in the doghouse. You might need to add my son to that mailing list. It's all right, send him a letter also. But Mother's Day was a few weeks ago. And so it's Mother's Day morning, Sunday morning, and he and I are in the car coming back from somewhere, and he goes, "Dad, we need to stop by the drugstore." Why? Oh, it's Mother's Day. I need to get something. So, okay. So 12 o'clock, Mother's Day morning, we swing into the store and go over to the card section, and I let him, do his work, and he gets a card and some flowers and things, and all right, cool. We'll drive home, and we'll start to celebrate Mother's Day. And so he picked out a great card that, a 10-year-old would have. Mom, no matter how old I get, I'll always be your little boy, real nice caricature on the front. So we're driving home, and all of a sudden in the back seat, he just starts roaring, laughing. I mean, just uncontrollably roaring. And I go, what? And he reads me the inside of the card, and it says, "Meaning, of course, it's still perfectly acceptable for you to do my laundry because you enjoy it so much." And I said, well, why didn't you laugh in the card store? He said, "Oh, well, I didn't read the inside of the card when I picked it out, Dad." And then I realized he's growing up and becoming a man. All right, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. There's two things. Number one, guys wait till the last minute a lot of times. Not on purpose, but sometimes we're just busy. And number two, sometimes we just pick the card that just looks, it just looks good, okay? We eventually read it, okay? But we pick the one that looks good. And so you're probably asking, what the hell does this have to do with floodplain management? I'm getting to that. There's a lot of cool, glitzy, products out there. And to me, what is important is that with all the risk map products and all the data and all the cool things you can do, you have to have a vision in mind. You have to actually read the whole card, figure out what it means. Don't do what guys do and just pick the shiny, fancy thing that's the coolest thing, unless you're going to use it effectively. And so hopefully my presentation shows that if you begin with the end in mind, you have a vision of how you want to manage your floodplains, how you want to manage your risk. Some of those fancy products will work great, okay? But make sure that you have a purpose for them. Charlotte-Mecklenburg, this is kind of the vision of how we want to use our floodplains. Every community is different. Greenways, open space, parks, flood control, all those kind of things. We're not there because we built in a lot of them. But that's kind of the vision that our council bought in on. So real quick orientation. I'm with Stormwater Services, and our mission is to protect life and property and restore the natural and beneficial functions of the floodplain. And fortunately, because we're a stormwater utility, we have resilient funding. One of the things I like to say is I feel like in order to become a resilient community, you need resilient funding to do it. Okay? If we were competing with the schools and the libraries and we didn't have a dedicated funding source, we would probably be going through all the ebbs and flows of a lot of other communities. And so if you can figure out how to get fee-based funding or stable funding sources to where you can do your job over time, you're going to be at a whole lot better shape. So in 1993, that's when our utility was created. Everything I'm going to talk about has to do with the FEMA floodplains and not the minor system storm drains and pipes. And it all started with a guidance document in 1999. I'm not going to go over all this. Our floodplain management timeline and history goes back even further than this, but in the late 90s, we got serious. And of course, it was a result of a few floods back to back. We got serious and we said we can't keep doing business the same way. These are some of the elements in this soup to nuts program that we have. We do flood buyouts and elevations. We have stormwater regulations for detention. We maintain and manage our own flood maps. We have a flood information notification system where the fire department's one of our big partners. We do outreach, community outreach, flood safety, planning, all those things. But I'm going to touch on three main things today: mapping, mitigation, and planning. So just to give you a snapshot of our mapping initiatives, what is the core function of local government? I mean, what is kind of the bread and butter of local government? Most people, I think, would say public safety, protecting life and property. I mean, we have policemen, we have firemen, we have all of those things. That's one of the core functions. Well, why does this happen? Well, there we go. Why does this typically happen? FEMA comes in, engineers come in, the community wants the floodplain down here. The floodplain and the engineers really should be up here. If the interest is life safety and protecting property, this is how it should be. The engineers should be able to come into a community and say, well, this is the 100-year flood elevation, this is the 500-year flood elevation. Well, gosh, we have to protect our citizens. Let's make sure, yes, the data is accurate, but let's use this mapping data to protect life and property of our citizens. It has impacts on flood insurance affordability for residents. It's one of the biggest issues. The maps keep going up. So your new construction now has higher flood insurance rates. You need to look to the future. Future loss of life and property, tax base, unsustainable growth. So similar to other emergency response, NFI communities should view, in my opinion, accurate flood maps as vital to their mission of public safety. Just like fire trucks, just like police cars. I mean, to protect your citizens, you wouldn't have a fire truck that only had 3 tires on it. So why do we have flood maps that are outdated, or why are we fighting to have lower flood elevations when they're a key element to protecting our citizens and their life safety and keeping an eye toward the future? This is our flood map history. This is our story. We started with maps from the 70s, and we had them until 2004. And in the mid-90s, we realized that they were not good. Okay, they were not good. And Charlotte's a growing area. And so we made a conscious decision to update our maps. We worked with FEMA. We partnered with FEMA when we updated our flood maps. And one of the unique things that we do is we map future floodplains. We decided that we couldn't continue to map the FEMA floodplain and then in 10 years have the elevation go up again because of growth and development or climate change or more intense rainfalls or storms. We need to get ahead of the curve in Charlotte. We went digital back in the early 2000s, and then we got into risk map type of updates where we really provided even more data. And now you can get to our website. It's iPad and tablet friendly because that's the way that a lot of the folks in Charlotte are getting their information. So our philosophy on future floodplains starts with the floodplains are meant to flood. We have people and property, but they're meant to flood. Our goal is not to keep them from flooding. Our goal is to manage the risk in those areas so that they can store flood water. We do have upland storage for construction. We try to implement no adverse impact techniques when development occurs. But these changes account for future development, and we feel like lower future risk and lower future flood insurance rates are what we're after with these future conditions flood maps. I'm going to shift to our mitigation, the second element, our mitigation and buyout program. We started getting serious about this in 1999. We had people showing up with mops and buckets at council meeting and said, do something. Telling us to buy flood insurance is not a solution. All right, when I woke up in the middle of the night and I hear dishes clanking in my bedroom because it started raining overnight and it wakes me up and I step out of bed into water. Buying flood insurance, yes, it helps, but that's not the solution. And so to date, we've been able to remove over 550 families from the floodplain. We prioritized, we partnered with FEMA and the state to do a lot with grant money, but we've done a lot on our own. We've restored 150 acres of floodplain, and we've actually, because of events that have occurred since our buyouts, we've already avoided 25 million estimate in losses. Those aren't benefits calculated, those are actual estimates of flood events that have occurred over the last 12 years that we've been doing buyouts and avoided. And we haven't had the big one where we haven't had a big HMGP. We've done it all in the context of FEMA's grant programs and kind of chunked along over time. A few pictures here. It's a before and after picture of one of my favorite projects. We didn't own a lick of land, and we were able to go in and buy about 70 homes, restore the floodplain. You can see the city of Charlotte in the background. It's a beautiful greenway along here, public education signage, all the great things you would think of when you get people out of harm's way. So we work in residential areas. We also work in non-residential areas. We've done some commercial acquisitions and some multifamily acquisitions. If you think about it, multifamily, there were in this complex, there were over 300 people living in this apartment complex. I mean, the burden on the emergency responders when this area floods to evacuate 300 people, in a matter of, say, 30 minutes as the creek's rising is incredible, in addition to the damage to the buildings. And so it took a long time and a lot of effort, a lot of creative thinking and negotiating with attorneys related to this owner. But we were able to get most of this apartment complex out of the floodplain. And our Red Cross officials and our emergency responders thank us profusely because this was a very difficult situation for them when heavy rain was predicted. And we also do some even, I guess, higher dollar things where we work really right next to downtown. We partner with our Parks Department and part of urban redevelopment. An old mall, removed it, uncapped the stream. We're able to buy a lot of those buildings out and built kind of an urban greenway along this corridor right next to downtown. So we do a lot of good things. So a few conclusions on mitigation. We need to incentivize public and private mitigation. Government can't do it all. We need to figure out ways to incentivize the public to also take mitigation actions. I hope that we can get to a point where we allow incremental mitigation to lower flood insurance rates. Maybe the building's still not compliant, but we can do some things to lower flood claims and therefore lower rates. And I think people will take action and communicate actuarial rates to the policyholder. This is a big deal. I'm going to cover it in an example in a minute. When Biggert Waters 12 came out, we saw some changes on the ground in Charlotte because people started to know what their risk would be. So before I get into that, the last thing, planning. We did a really cool plan last couple years. We built a risk assessment, risk reduction plan. Every property in our county now has a risk score associated with it, which is a level of risk. It's not based upon how much flood insurance damage will cause. It's a risk score. It takes into account high velocity zones, takes into account accessibility to the property during a flood. It's intended to try to capture all the consequences rather than just the structure itself. And we did that over time. Here's the concept. We calculated flood property scores with all the great risk map data and elevation data and all those kind of things that we had. We leveraged that mapping data to do great planning. We developed planning level risk reduction recommendations so a citizen can go see whether an elevation on their particular property we think would be effective or highly effective or not recommended, acquisitions, elevating heating, cooling systems, all of those kind of things. So we went through all that. So moving the needle. Are we moving the needle? Does any of this matter at all? I want to start by just telling a real quick story here on return on investment. And this is what I was saying earlier. The Biggert Waters really gave us a case study to see how people would react. So it was about a month ago. I was at my desk, phone rang, answered the phone. The citizen on the other end started asking me questions about elevation certificate and should he get an elevation certificate? He actually lives very close to one of our buyout areas, but it's just on the fringe of the floodplain. And he's telling me what he did. And he said, I got a bill from my flood insurance agent telling me that my rates were going to go up to a certain amount. And it happened that his flood insurance agent was one of his friends, so they actually could work together more collaboratively probably than most. And so he's telling me that the higher flood insurance rate prompted the question, what can I do about it? He apparently called our office and talked to one of our staff, Melanie Brock, who's here, and she gave him some advice, and he got an elevation certificate, and he realized that if he put in flood vents and took a utility room that was below grade and put in some floodproofing and added some vents to that utility room and elevated his HVAC system, which needed to be replaced, he could be fully compliant. And his agent was able to tell him what his new rate would be. This doesn't happen all the time. He's telling me this story, and he's telling me as he's doing things, and I'm putting the phone on mute and screaming down the hall, hey, there's a guy in here that actually put in flood vents. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay. This guy said he raised his heating and cooling system on his own. So I'm actually kind of, at that point, I'm looking around the room, looking for like a camera. I figured like Chad McGinnis or Larry Larson. I figured I'm on candid camera, and they set up a camera, and they have some guy pranking me that actually is doing mitigation. But that wasn't the case. So he said that the issue was, it was a no-brainer. The return on investment worked. He said the payback was 3 or 4 years. He invested about $2,000 or $3,000 in all these different things. He did a lot of the work himself, but the payback was clear. That's how it needs to work, folks. It's got to work like that, where property owners can clearly see what the impact on the risk and the rates are going to be. So I want to get to our data. These are the slides you all waited for. This is our dollar-wise, our investment in mitigation and our calculated future benefits. So to date, we estimate future savings of about $280 million, and we've spent about $50 million to date. One of the most interesting things about this, in the first 2 years of the program, we were fortunate enough to not have to do BCAs on everything and be more comprehensive. And the first 1 or 2 years of our program, actually the first year, on paper, was not cost effective. It's the best project that we've done. It's the best buyout, the best bang for our buck at a local level. But on paper, the benefits, don't compute out that way. But we went with what we knew the risk would be. So here are the last 2 slides that show, are we moving the needle? Those flood risk scores that I talked about, if you kind of put this in context, in 1999, before we started doing mapping and regulating the future conditions floodplains and mitigation, you can kind of see on the first bar what our total risk in our floodplains in Charlotte was. Okay, the number doesn't matter, but just the level does. Without mitigation, and then you can see every year how our risk in our community has changed based upon these scores that we calculated. It has decreased. We've decreased our overall risk as a community, when you add up all the properties in the floodplain or touching the floodplain, by about 35%. 35%. We have about 4,000 buildings and parcels in and around the floodplain. All right, without mitigation, most people would agree that would actually, if you do nothing at all, over 10 years, you'd probably agree that the folks in the floodplain, their risk is continuing to gradually increasing. So kind of in that zone is where we would be if we did not have a mitigation program and we just sat there. What about our floodplain maps? This is really interesting. It's preliminary information. We're really going to refine it more, but I wanted to present this today because it's a first cut at it. I did it on the back of a bar napkin last night. It's preliminary, kind of like FEMA maps a little bit. Kidding. No, we put some time into this. So future conditions mapping. without future conditions maps, we projected based upon actually every single year how many buildings got built in and around the floodplain, what happened and what would have happened in terms of risk. Believe it or not, the risk actually still ticks up a little bit, the way that we calculate the scores. I mean, people build and they could put a fence in the floodplain or put their shed back in the floodplain, and that goes into our risk score, even though it's fully compliant. So we're seeing our floodplain maps with about a 25% reduction. When you put those two things together, this is Charlotte-Mecklenburg's what I call risk profile, right here. The blue is what we've done, what our computed risk level is currently every year from 99 to 2013. If we didn't have a buyout program, we'd be at the top of the red. If we didn't do any buyouts and we used the existing FEMA maps, no future conditions, we just regulated to the FEMA minimum, and we didn't have a mitigation program, we'd be at that green bar today. We'd be 300%, about 300% higher. Our community risk would be 300% higher over the last 12 years than when we started. So these efforts cumulatively take place. Mapping and mitigation, they make a difference. So closing with three conclusions. One, have a community resilience vision. That's what I started with. Begin with the end in mind. Have a vision and work toward that vision. It's not going to happen overnight. Number two, stable, dedicated funding really is important. If all you're using is disaster declarations, you're going to do great work, but I don't know that it's going to be sustainable over the long haul. You know, you're going to have ebbs and flows. And lastly, and I apologize to our sponsors, because these aren't the sponsors, but this company is not a sponsor, but they've just got the ultimate, logo and saying. Third thing is just do it. Just do it. Get it done. Thank you.